Number 5, Grant Robertson.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. I seek leave for this question to be answered by the Minister of Finance, for whom it was originally set down.
Order. No, I was unaware that it had been transferred, but if it has been transferred, that is the decision. Order. If the member wants to stay to ask the question, he better not interrupt in that vein. The member can proceed if he so wishes, otherwise we can move forward.
Disappointment.
Order. Question
To the
number
Minister
5,
for Primary
Grant Robertson.
Industries, does he agree with the advice of the Prime Minister in regard to dairy prices made in November last year, when the average price at the global dairy auction was US $2,561 a tonne, for farmers not to get too worried and that the price would bottom out soon and start climbing again? If so, can he advise what is the latest average price at the global dairy auction?
The Honourable Nathan Guy.
Mr. Speaker, yes. The very good point the Prime Minister was making is that global commodity prices are indeed volatile. They go up and they go down, but the medium to long-term outlook for dairy is very positive, with growth in key markets in Asia. The latest average price at the GDT auction overnight was $2,345 US, which is 29% higher than the August low. As we all know, prices have been affected this year by international factors beyond our control, including growth in the overall supply, trade sanctions by Russia, and the EU lifting their dairy quota.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
In light of that answer, does he further agree with the Prime Minister that, quote, the biggest indicator you would see if there really was a long-term systemic problem would be a reduction in land prices?
The Honourable Nathan Guy.
Well, Mr. Speaker, land prices, as we know, go up and down. But the important point is that the long-term outlook for dairying is extremely positive. And just a few months ago, the Labor Party was calling it a crisis in the dairy industry, and actually prices are higher than when Labor were calling it a crisis.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
Does he now agree with the Prime Minister that there might be a systemic problem with today's RIAN's Dairy Farm Price Index noting a 19% fall in prices for dairy farms?
The Honourable Nathan Guy.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the dairy prices are volatile, but the long-term outlook for farm prices is very strong, because we only have a limited supply of land. And as a result, prices will go up and down. That's something that the Labor Party doesn't seem to understand. Land prices go up and down, but the important point is the medium to long-term outlook for the dairy industry is incredibly strong, and farmers are taking a long-term view.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
Was the Prime Minister correct when he said the biggest indicator you would see if there was a really long-term systemic problem would be a reduction in land prices?
Honourable Nathan Guy.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I agree with the Prime Minister's comments, but importantly, what I've said is you need to take a long-term outlook, and that's why Labor, day in, day out, extract a small subset of figures and give them profile. Well, in actual fact, what the member should be doing is looking at the long-term outlook for dairying. And because we have significant free trade deals with Asian communities, and because we are supportive of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that party won't even support, which is going to have significant gains for the dairy industry.
Order. I have a supplementary question from the Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, Honourable Damien O'Connor.
If global dairy trade is supposed to be global, why have the 7 other companies who have used the platform withdrawn, leaving Fonterra as the only company trying to flog off its commodities on a Fonterra-owned but Boston-based trading platform?
Insofar as this ministerial responsibility, the Honourable Nathan Guy.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government doesn't have a role in deciding which companies participate on the GDT. That is indeed a decision for private businesses to make. And for the member to stand up and say that it's all about Fonterra's commodities, well, Fonterra knows that they've got challenges in front of their own business model and they need to look at long-term value-add contracts.
Order. Supplementary question, right, Honourable Winston.
Minister, if the issue of trade isn't so important, why is there a boycott to the second biggest importer of dairy products in the world, namely Russia, which he goes along with, as does the Prime Minister?
The Honourable Nathan Guy.
Mr Speaker, I'm surprised that the member is alluding to the House this afternoon that New Zealand should be there negotiating a free trade agreement with Russia. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense. Well, the member should realise that just recently Fonterra has had some plants relisted into that market, but the member doesn't seem to understand the wider geopolitical issues with right now. And if the member was supportive of free trade agreement...
Order. The Minister will resume his seat. He's up. Question number 6.